Her career was publicly ruined, shattered by a single mishandling of a priceless artifact. But cold-blooded mafia boss Adrian Vance has no interest in justice. He captures her, declaring, "You're mine until it's perfect." Now, trapped in his lavish penthouse, she's his captive protege. Will she mend his scroll, or become his next obsession? The scent of antiquity was Emily Hayes's constant companion, a rich, complex perfume of aged parchment, linseed oil, and forgotten secrets. It clung to her threadbare tweed blazer, seeped into her skin, and settled deep in her lungs, a bittersweet reminder of her purpose and her predicament. For 7 years, Emily had breathed life back into canvases thought lost, mended the fractured whispers of history, and restored the silent grandeur of masterpieces within the hallowed, marble-clad halls of the Aurelius. This was no mere auction house. It was a cathedral of old money, a fortress where generations of wealth, influence, and hushed scandals resided. Yet, for Emily, it was undeniably a cage. Her workstation, tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the restoration lab, was a microcosm of her life, meticulously organized, efficient, yet overshadowed by the larger, brighter spaces reserved for those with more impressive titles and even more impressive surnames. Dust motes danced in the lone beam of sunlight that occasionally pierced the high, arched windows, illuminating the minuscule, almost invisible flaws she painstakingly corrected on a Baroque landscape. Her fingers, nimble and precise, moved with an instinct born of innate talent and relentless practice. Each stroke of the tiny brush, each whisper of the solvent-dampened cotton swab, was a prayer, a communion with the past. This was where she felt truly alive, truly herself, lost in the delicate dance of bringing beauty back from the brink. But the real world, cold and unforgiving, always waited. A dull ache throbbed behind her eyes, a familiar companion born of too many late nights under unforgiving halogen lamps and too few nourishing meals. Her meager salary, barely enough to cover rent for her tiny, perpetually damp Brooklyn apartment, and the ever-increasing cost of specialist conservation supplies she often bought herself, was a constant, gnawing anxiety. She envied the effortless way her colleagues floated through the gilded hallways, their expensive shoes barely registering the worn mosaic tiles. Emily felt the weight of every step, the shame of her scuffed boots against their polished heels. A shadow fell across her work, chilling the already cool air of the lab. Emily didn't need to look up. The faint, cloying sweetness of Mr. Thorne's bespoke cologne always preceded him, a sickly sweet herald of his presence. "Still at it, Miss Hay?" His voice, a smooth baritone laced with condescension, made the hairs on her arms prickle. "One might think you were chained to that table." Emily forced a polite, weary smile, her gaze still fixed on the canvas. "Just finishing up, Mr. Thorne. The archival varnish needs a few more hours to cure properly." Of course, of course." He leaned against the archway, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her practical, paint-splattered apron. Always so diligent. A pity such diligence isn't always recognized in the proper channels. The insinuation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Thorne, her former mentor and now a powerful board member, was a master of subtle manipulation. He had discovered her at a small, struggling gallery 7 years ago, promising her a golden ticket into the prestigious world of the Aurelius. What he delivered, however, was a perpetual state of indentured servitude, cloaked in opportunity. He had taken credit for her groundbreaking paper on Renaissance pigment degradation. He had presented her innovative technique for restoring water-damaged manuscripts as his own. And every time Emily dared to voice a dissenting opinion or, God forbid, demand proper acknowledgement, Thorne would remind her of the debt. The initial training. The apartment deposit he'd generously covered when she first arrived in the city. The vague, shadowy promises of future promotions that never materialized. She was trapped, a talented bird in a cage, her wings clipped by financial dependence and his insidious control. A wave of frustration, hot and bitter, washed over her. She gripped her brush tighter, the fine bristles bending slightly. He knows exactly what he's doing. He thrives on this. The injustice of it all burned like acid in her throat. She yearned to scream, to smash something, to demand the recognition she so desperately deserved. But years of quiet resignation had taught her the futility of such outbursts. The Aurelius, with its ancient rules and unwritten codes, always protected its own, and Emily, the girl from nowhere, was not its own. Speaking of proper channels, Thorne continued, breaking her internal turmoil. The Serpent's Whisper scroll arrives tomorrow. A priceless artifact, as you know. Mr. Vance himself will be present for the preliminary viewing. Ensure your preparations are meticulous. Any flaw, Miss Hayes, will reflect poorly on all of us, especially you. He pushed off the archway, the soft rustle of his expensive fabric a final, dismissive punctuation. Don't disappoint. He walked away, leaving behind the lingering scent of his cologne and a fresh wave of dread. The Serpent's Whisper. Emily knew the legend surrounding the ancient Egyptian scroll, a masterpiece of artistry and an enigma of history, rumored to be cursed, passed down through generations of a notoriously secretive family. Its value was immeasurable, both culturally and financially. And Adrian Vance, even in the hushed corridors of the Aurelius, his name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear. A reclusive billionaire, a collector of the rare and the dangerous, a man whose presence could shift the very atmosphere of a room. Emily had never met him, but the stories were enough to make her hands clench. She stared at the Baroque landscape, its vibrant colors now seeming muted, lifeless. Her quiet despair deepened into a cold knot in her stomach. Tomorrow. The weight of that single word pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She knew with an unsettling certainty that the arrival of the Serpent's Whisper and its mysterious owner would mark more than just another day at the Aurelius. It would be a turning point, for better or for worse. And somehow she had a terrible feeling it would be for the worse. The cage she inhabited was about to be rattled, and Emily was utterly unprepared for the storm that was coming. The grand salon of the Aurelius glittered like a fallen constellation. Chandeliers dripped light onto polished marble floors, reflecting the shimmering gowns of the city's elite and the sharp, dark suits of men who wielded fortunes like silent weapons. The air thrummed with a low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the delicate clinking of crystal glasses and the distant strains of a string quartet. Expensive perfumes, heavy with jasmine and oud, mingled with the faint, metallic tang of money. Emily, dressed in a borrowed, slightly ill-fitting black dress that still bore the faint scent of mothballs, felt utterly out of place, a shadow amidst the dazzling spectacle. Her palms were damp, not from the stifling warmth of the crowded room, but from a potent cocktail of anxiety and reverence. Tonight was the unveiling of the Serpent's Whisper, and Emily, despite her hidden status, had been granted the sacred duty of its final pre-auction inspection. The scroll, a relic from ancient Egypt, was housed in a climate-controlled, bulletproof display case, bathed in soft, theatrical light at the center of the room. It wasn't just an artifact. It was a legend whispered about in hushed tones by scholars and collectors alike. Its papyrus, delicate as a dried leaf, bore intricate hieroglyphs, believed to be a lost incantation, a story of forgotten power. Its estimated value was rumored to be in the tens of millions, a figure that made Emily's stomach clench with both awe and dread. She moved through the throng, her eyes fixed on the scroll, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. Each step was carefully measured, her focus absolute. She needed to check the humidity levels within the case, ensure no new microfissures had appeared from the slight shift in temperature, and confirm the seals were absolutely airtight. Failure was not an option. For this piece, for this owner, failure was professional oblivion. As she reached the velvet ropes cordoning off the display, a sudden jarring jolt sent a shockwave through her. A heavy-set man, his face flushed with champagne, stumbled backward from conversation, his elbow catching her shoulder with unexpected force. Emily gasped, thrown off balance. Her careful concentration shattered. Time seemed to distend, stretching into an agonizing slow-motion nightmare. Her hand, instinctively flailing for purchase, flew out. Her fingers, usually so gentle, so precise, brushed against the polished glass of the display case. It was a fleeting contact, less than a whisper, but it was enough. The ancient papyrus, unbelievably fragile, vibrated from the minor impact. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the onlookers as a tiny, almost imperceptible tear, a devastating, jagged imperfection, marred the pristine surface of the serpent's whisper. It was no larger than a grain of rice, yet in that moment, it was a gaping wound, a silent scream of destruction. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound of her own heartbeat deafened her, a frantic, accusing thrumming. The world narrowed to that single, catastrophic flaw. Her eyes burned hot with tears of horror and self-reproach. No. Oh God, no. A cold wave of nausea washed over her, making the glittering room spin. This wasn't just a mistake, it was the end. The end of her career, perhaps even the end of her freedom. The weight of potential lawsuits, the professional blacklisting, the sheer crushing humiliation descended upon her like an avalanche. Thorne would revel in this. Her mind raced, a desperate, scrambling chaos of fear and despair. How could she possibly fix something so ancient, so delicate, so utterly priceless? The answer, a chilling whisper in her soul, was she couldn't. A hush, profound and terrifying, fell over the grand salon. The music died. Conversations ceased. All eyes, sharp with judgment and morbid curiosity, turned to Emily, impaling her under their collective glare. She felt utterly exposed, naked, her cheap dress suddenly feeling like a scarlet letter. She wished the floor would swallow her whole, wished for the merciful oblivion of darkness. Then a new presence, colder and sharper than the chill of her impending ruin, cut through the silence. It wasn't just a man entering the room. It was an event, a seismic shift in the atmosphere. The crowd parted almost reverently, forming a clear aisle through the glittering throng. Emily, still trembling, slowly lifted her gaze. He moved with an unhurried, predatory grace, a stark silhouette against the distant, shimmering light of the city. Adrian Vance. His name, a whispered legend, now took corporeal form. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered beneath a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. His dark hair, meticulously swept back, framed a face that could have been carved from ancient stone, sharp angles, a strong jawline, and lips set in a permanent, dispassionate line. But it was his eyes that truly seized her, twin pools of pale winter gray, clear and glacial, yet somehow burning with an intelligent, almost dangerous intensity. They were the eyes of a man who saw everything, missed nothing, and judged without mercy. He walked directly to the display case, his gaze sweeping over the scroll with an owner's possessive care, then snagging on the minuscule tear. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle tremor that nevertheless sent a fresh jolt of fear through Emily. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. His silence was far more terrifying, a coiled threat. Then, slowly, deliberately, his gaze lifted from the wounded artifact and impaled Emily. It was a look that stripped away her defenses, her pretensions, leaving her feeling utterly vulnerable, laid bare. She felt a strange dichotomy of emotions, raw, stinging humiliation, but also a flicker of something akin to awe at the sheer, unadulterated power emanating from him. He was a force of nature, contained and controlled, but undeniably lethal. That artifact is priceless, he stated, his voice low, a velvet rumble that somehow cut through the hushed room like a razor. It wasn't a question, but a cold, irrefutable fact. Each word landed with the weight of granite. His eyes, fixed on hers, seemed to bore into her very soul, dissecting her, analyzing her fear, her guilt, her desperate yearning for redemption. Emily swallowed, her throat suddenly dry as dust. "Ah, I am so sorry, sir. It was an accident." "Will." He cut her off, a single dismissive flick of his hand. "Apologies are inconsequential. Solutions are what I require." His gaze hardened, possessive and utterly chilling. "And now, so is the person who damaged it. You, Miss Hayes, will personally restore it, under my direct supervision. You belong to me until it is perfect." The declaration hung in the air, a shocking, audacious claim that stole the remaining air from Emily's lungs. "You belong to me." The words echoed in her mind, not as a polite request or even a stern directive, but as an undeniable decree. He wasn't just demanding her expertise, he was demanding her. Her time, her talent, her very being, until his priceless artifact, and by extension she was perfect. A hot flush crawled up Emily's neck, a potent blend of indignation and something akin to a terrifying thrill. Who does he think he is? Yet, beneath the surge of rebellious anger, a colder, more primal fear coiled. This man, with his glacial eyes and his unwavering authority, saw her not as an individual with dreams and a life, but as a tool, an extension of his will. A valuable, damaged asset that he now owned. His eyes, those pale winter-glass eyes, held hers, challenging any thought of defiance, crushing any nascent spark of protest. There was no room for negotiation, no space for argument. His decision was absolute. In that moment, surrounded by the silent, judging gazes of the elite, Emily understood. She had walked into the Aurelius, an invisible conservator, struggling to survive. Now, with one accidental touch, she had fallen into the orbit of Adrian Vance, a man who saw no distinction between ownership and protection, between valuable art and a vulnerable woman. A chilling sense of fate, cold and unavoidable, settled deep in her bones. Her carefully constructed, humble life had just been irrevocably shattered. The gilded cage of the Aurelius had suddenly expanded, revealing a much larger, much more dangerous prison. And Adrian Vance, the enigmatic billionaire, the owner of priceless artifacts and untold power, held the key. The serpent's whisper might have been cursed, but Emily knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was the one truly ensnared. Her heart thundered, not just from fear, but from the dawning realization that her quiet, ordinary life had just ended. Now, she was undeniably Adrian Vance's. And the storm had only just begun. The words, "You belong to me until it is perfect," echoed in Emily's ears, a chilling mantra as Adrian Vance dismissed the stunned gala attendees with a curt nod and a look that promised swift repercussions for anyone who lingered. Thorne, pale and visibly unnerved, had retreated into the shadows like a startled rodent. Emily, still rooted to the spot, felt Adrian's hand close around her arm, not gently, but with an unyielding possessiveness that made her breath catch. The warmth of his touch, despite its unwelcome authority, sent an unnerving shiver through her. "We are leaving," he stated, his voice devoid of negotiation. Now, before she could form a coherent protest, he was guiding her through the still whispering crowd, his presence carving a path that no one dared obstruct. The brief, suffocating ride in his impossibly sleek black sedan was a blur of flashing lights and Emily's racing thoughts. Her tiny apartment, her meager belongings, her semblance of an independent life, all felt impossibly distant, dissolving into a past she was being ruthlessly severed from. "My things," she finally managed, her voice a reedy whisper against the hushed hum of the expensive engine. "I need to collect my things." Adrian didn't even glance at her. His gaze was fixed on the rain-slicked Manhattan skyline. "Already handled." The bluntness of his reply stole her breath. Handled? By whom? When? The efficiency was terrifying, a stark reminder of the sheer, impenetrable power he wielded. She was not just being ordered, she was being absorbed. They ascended, in an elevator that felt more like a vault, to a penthouse that sprawled across the upper echelons of a crystalline tower, a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the glittering, indifferent expanse of the city. The doors slid open silently, revealing a cavernous space bathed in soft, recessed lighting, exuding an almost intimidating opulence. The air, cool and dry, carried the faint, clean scent of polished wood and something subtly metallic, like ozone before a storm. Emily stepped onto a floor of gleaming dark marble, its coldness seeping through the thin soles of her shoes. Her worn tweed blazer, her cheap dress, suddenly felt grotesquely out of place amidst the minimalist grandeur. Every surface was immaculate, every piece of furniture a work of art in itself. There were no superfluous trinkets, no personal touches, just stark, elegant perfection. And everywhere she sensed it, the silent, unseen eyes of surveillance. A subtle gleam on a smoke detector, a barely visible lens in the corner of a ceiling fixture. She was not just in his home, she was in his perimeter. A woman with sharply styled dark hair, her posture as precise as a freshly drawn line, emerged from a discreet doorway. Her eyes, intelligent and unblinking, swept over Emily with a cool, assessing gaze. This was Tia, Adrian's personal assistant, and Emily suspected much more. A ghost of the woman Adrian had spoken to earlier at the gala. "Miss Hayes," Tia stated, her voice even devoid of warmth. "Your luggage has been placed in your quarters. Mr. Vance requires your presence in the restoration studio at 0700 hours. Breakfast will be served at 0630. My quarters," Emily echoed, the word feeling utterly alien. "I have my own apartment." Tia's thin lips barely twitched. "You are now a resident here. For the duration of the restoration project. For security purposes. Mr. Vance's orders." Her tone brooked no argument. A man of imposing build, with a shaved head and a faint, almost invisible scar tracing his jawline, stepped into view from another hidden entrance. His eyes, dark and watchful, lingered on Emily for a moment too long. Marcus, another of Adrian's silent, efficient sentinels. Their cold, professional demeanor was a stark reminder that Emily was not a guest, but a charge. A valuable piece of inventory. Resentment, hot and sharp, flared within her. She spun to face Adrian, who had moved to stand before a panoramic window, his back to her, gazing out at the city as if it were his personal kingdom. "I can't just move in here. I have a life. I have responsibilities." He turned slowly, his expression utterly unreadable, his eyes like chips of pale ice. "Your responsibilities now lie with the serpent's whisper. And with me." His voice was soft, dangerously quiet, yet it carried an unyielding authority that pressed down on her, stealing her air. "Every resource you require is here. Every distraction removed. Your focus will be absolute." "But this isn't right," she protested, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "You can't just kidnap me." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his lips, a fleeting glimpse of something dangerous beneath his controlled exterior. "Kidnap, Miss Hayes? You damaged an irreplaceable artifact. I am merely ensuring its proper repair. And your eye availability. You will find that my methods, though perhaps unconventional, are ultimately efficient." He took a step closer, his heightened presence utterly dominating her. The subtle scent of his expensive cologne, sharp and undeniably masculine, filled her senses, overwhelming the sterile perfection of the penthouse. "You will reside in a dedicated suite adjacent to a custom-built studio. You will have access to the finest materials, the most advanced equipment. You will be safe. You will be free from external pressures." His eyes, however, promised the exact opposite of freedom. Emily felt a spark of defiance, small but fierce, ignite within her. She was not a possession. She was Emily Hayes, a conservator, an artist in her own right. "What if I refuse?" she challenged, her voice trembling slightly, but holding firm. Adrian's gaze sharpened, a predatory glint entering his eyes. "Refuse, Miss Hayes, and you will find your professional life not merely over, but erased. Your reputation irrevocably tarnished. Your future a barren landscape. You will become a cautionary tale in the art world. Or you can embrace this opportunity, restore my scroll, and perhaps earn a measure of my consideration." His last word, consideration, was loaded, a subtle threat and a tantalizing promise rolled into one. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She hated him. She hated his arrogance, his control, his absolute power. Yet, a part of her, the professional artist buried beneath layers of resentment and fear, felt a thrill. The serpent's whisper. An unparalleled challenge. A chance to truly prove herself, even under duress. But at what cost? She stared into his unyielding eyes, a silent battle raging within her. Fear of the unknown future against the suffocating reality of her present. The idea of being caged, even in gilded luxury, was abhorrent. But the prospect of professional annihilation, of being utterly obliterated by this man, was even worse. Finally, she exhaled, a ragged, defeated sound. Fine, she whispered, the word tasting like ash. I'll do it. A ghost of a smile, cold and victorious, touched Adrian's lips. Excellent. Welcome to your new reality, Miss Hayes. He gestured toward Tia. Tia will show you to your quarters. Rest. You have much work ahead. As Tia led her away, Emily glanced back at Adrian Vance, still standing by the window, a dark, imposing figure surveying his dominion. She was trapped. A gilded prison, but even in this gilded cage, the spark of defiance still flickered. She would restore his scroll, but she would not be broken. Not by him. Not by anyone. And a strange, unwelcome curiosity about the man who now owned her, physically and professionally, began to bloom in the sterile confines of her fear. This was his trap. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could find a way to turn it into her own. The sterile perfection of Adrian Vance's penthouse quickly became Emily's gilded cage. Her quarters were a suite of rooms that dwarfed her entire old apartment, outfitted with luxury she'd only seen in magazines, yet felt entirely impersonal. But the true horror of her captivity, and paradoxically her purpose, was the restoration studio. It was a conservator's dream, custom-built and flooded with natural light, equipped with every conceivable tool and material, many of which Emily had only read about in specialized journals. The Serpent's Whisper lay before her, a daunting, magnificent challenge that both terrified and exhilarated her. Her days settled into a rigid routine, dictated by Tia with unnerving precision. Breakfast at 0630, often a solitary affair in the vast, silent dining room, followed by long, intense hours in the studio. Adrian was a constant, unsettling presence. He wouldn't always speak, sometimes just appearing in the doorway, observing her with an unnerving stillness that made her skin prickle. Other times, he would stride in, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished floor, and stand over her shoulder, his proximity a tangible weight. At first, these intrusions fueled her resentment. She worked with a furious, meticulous energy, channeling her anger into the delicate brushstrokes, the painstaking analysis of the parchment. She spoke only when necessary, offering curt, professional updates on the scroll's condition, her voice carefully devoid of emotion. But Adrian, to her surprise, was never dismissive of her expertise. He listened, his pale eyes studying her face as she explained the complexities of the ancient ink, the fragility of the silk binding. He would ask surprisingly astute questions, revealing a depth of knowledge about historical artifacts that she hadn't expected from a man she'd initially pegged as merely a ruthless collector. One rainy afternoon, as Emily meticulously rehumidified a particularly stubborn section of the scroll, a delivery arrived. Tia, ever efficient, placed a small, velvet-lined box on her workbench. Inside lay an exquisite set of miniature Japanese brushes, crafted from the finest sable, each hair impossibly fine. Emily's breath hitched. She had mentioned, almost in passing weeks ago, how a particular technique required brushes of unparalleled precision, a type nearly impossible to acquire. Adrian had clearly remembered. He hadn't said a word, hadn't even acknowledged her surprised glance when he next appeared. It was a silent, almost covert act of care, unsettling in its unexpectedness. Another time, absorbed in her work, Emily had neglected her lunch. When she finally looked up, famished and lightheaded, a tray sat on a nearby table, laden with a surprisingly delicate sandwich, fresh fruit, and a cup of her favorite herbal tea brewed to perfection. Tia was nowhere in sight, and Emily knew with an odd certainty that it hadn't been Tia's initiative. It was Adrian's. These small, unsolicited gestures began to chip away at the solid wall of her animosity, leaving cracks through which a bewildering mix of curiosity and grudging respect began to filter. She also started to see glimpses of the man beneath the polished, ruthless exterior. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him staring out at the city's skyline, a profound weariness etched around his eyes, a shadow of something heavy lingering in their depths. There was a quiet intensity about him, a driven loneliness that resonated, strangely, with her own solitary dedication to her work. She'd always found solace in the quiet focus of restoration, and she began to wonder if he, too, was trapped by his own obsessions, his own burdens. Was the serpent's whisper merely another acquisition, or something more profound to him, a reflection of a personal quest? The atmosphere in the studio, once charged with her resentment, slowly began to shift. There were still long silences, but they were no longer hostile. Instead, they became a shared space, a quiet understanding blossoming between them as she poured her soul into the scroll. She found herself explaining her methods in greater detail, sharing her hypotheses about the scroll's origins, her voice gaining a passionate conviction she rarely displayed. In these moments, she saw a flicker of something almost akin to admiration in Adrian's eyes, a softening of the icy gaze that usually held her captive. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of deep violet and orange, Emily was meticulously cleaning a delicate pigment. Adrian was there, standing closer than usual, his arm leaning against the edge of her workbench. She felt the heat radiating from his proximity, a sudden, acute awareness of his masculine presence. The subtle scent of his expensive cologne, usually a symbol of his intimidating power, now had a disconcerting, almost intoxicating effect. She stumbled slightly, her hand brushing against his as she reached for a tool. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. He didn't move, but his breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, charged silence. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her face flushing crimson. Adrian's gaze, when she dared to meet it, was intense, unreadable, yet undeniably hungry. The predatory glint she had once feared now held a new, disorienting layer, one of raw, forbidden desire. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken words, with the intoxicating pull of something dangerous and inevitable. He cleared his throat, the sound rough, breaking the spell. "Continue your work, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a low rumble, but there was a tremor in it she hadn't heard before. "The scroll requires your complete attention." He turned and left the studio, leaving Emily trembling, the scroll forgotten for a moment. She was not just restoring an ancient artifact, she was unearthing layers within herself and within him that she hadn't known existed. The gilded prison was beginning to feel less like a cage and more like a crucible, forging a connection between captor and captive that was both terrifying and undeniably, thrillingly real. The whispers in the silence were growing louder, promising a future far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The initial whispers of attraction that had begun to stir between Emily and Adrian were swiftly drowned out by a creeping tide of unease within the studio. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, gnawing at Emily's meticulous nature. A small detail, meticulously restored the day before, would somehow be slightly askew when she returned. A delicate patch of parchment, painstakingly readhered, would show the faintest ripple, as if briefly disturbed. Her carefully catalogued notes, describing pigment mixtures and binding tensions, would sometimes appear subtly altered, an instruction here or a measurement there, just enough to sow a seed of doubt. Emily, whose entire career hinged on precision, felt a cold knot of frustration tighten in her stomach. At first, she blamed herself. Was she overtired? Was the pressure of Adrian's scrutiny finally getting to her? She meticulously rechecked her work, sometimes staying late, redoing sections that seemed to have spontaneously deteriorated. The paranoia gnawed at her, making her second-guess every decision. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by Adrian's cameras, but by something far more insidious. The incidents escalated. A tiny vial of rare medieval glue, which she'd been saving for a particularly fragile repair, was found uncapped and half evaporated. A fine-tipped etching tool, crucial for delicate work, had its tip mysteriously blunted. Emily's anxiety morphed into a simmering indignation. This wasn't carelessness. This was deliberate. But who? And why? Thorne immediately sprang to mind, his pale, resentful face from the gala a stark memory. Yet, how could he access her studio, a veritable fortress within Adrian's gilded prison? She tried to handle it discreetly. She knew Adrian's eyes were everywhere, and the last thing she wanted was to admit to sabotage within his supposedly impregnable domain, especially when the damage was so minor, so easily dismissed as her own fault. She doubled down, securing her materials, meticulously documenting every step with photographs, creating a paper trail to exonerate herself should the need arise. Her determination hardened. She would not let anyone undermine her work or her professional integrity. The turning point came with the pigments. Emily had been preparing a batch of historical pigments, painstakingly grinding minerals and mixing binders to match the scroll's original palette. She had left a small amount of a particularly vibrant vermilion to dry overnight, covered and sealed. The next morning, a faint, acrid smell clung to it. Testing it on a scrap of parchment, she watched in horror as the vibrant red curdled, then subtly discolored, becoming a dull, sickly orange. It was poisoned. Someone had introduced a chemical agent that would irrevocably damage the delicate pigment and, by extension, the scroll itself. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was no longer just about minor disruptions. This was an attack on the integrity of the scroll, a direct threat to her work and reputation. Fear, hot and sharp, flared within her. She almost marched directly to Adrian to confront him with the evidence, but something held her back. The memory of his cold, triumphant smile at the gala, his casual dismissal of the consequences, made her hesitate. She was in his world now, playing by his rules, and she instinctively knew that showing weakness or panic would only serve to amuse him. Meanwhile, Adrian Vance, though seemingly engrossed in his own affairs, was far from oblivious. He didn't miss the subtle changes in Emily's posture, the new tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted around the studio more frequently. He had also noticed the minor discrepancies she hadn't spoken of. His surveillance network, discreetly embedded throughout the penthouse, didn't just monitor Emily. It monitored everything. He had seen Thorne lurking in the periphery at the gala, his possessive gaze lingering on the scroll, and he knew Thorne's reputation for petty vindictiveness. He didn't need Emily's accusations. A few cryptic reports from his security chief confirmed his suspicions. An anomaly in a maintenance log, a brief unscheduled access granted to an unauthorized individual in the early hours of the morning, all quickly covered up. Adrian didn't confront Thorne, didn't even mention it to Emily. Instead, he simply unleashed his network. Subtly, insidiously, Thorne's own world began to unravel. Small, inconvenient truths about his past professional dealings began to surface. Suddenly, a promising acquisition for his gallery fell through due to unforeseen complications. A key associate mysteriously severed ties. These were not overt acts of aggression, but surgical strikes designed to cripple Thorne's influence, to remind him of the vast, unseen power Adrian wielded. Emily, engrossed in the heightened vigilance of her studio, didn't know the specifics of what Adrian was doing, but she felt the shift. The minor sabotages abruptly ceased. The odd blips in her materials vanished. There was an unspoken reprieve, a sense of an invisible shield having been raised around her work. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't even voiced her fears, yet Adrian's presence, his quiet, ruthless power, had somehow intervened. It was a terrifying, yet undeniably comforting realization. It offered her a new understanding of Adrian's world. He operated in shadows, his influence stretching far beyond the penthouse walls, capable of protecting or destroying with chilling efficiency. The relief that washed over her was profound, but it was also tinged with a fresh apprehension. She was safe, for now, under his unspoken protection. But what did that protection cost? And what would happen if, or when, she ever fell outside its formidable reach? The gilded prison now felt less like a cage and more like the heart of a vast, intricate web, and Emily was learning, with a mixture of fear and fascination, how to navigate its silken threads. The studio, usually a bastion of cool, clinical focus, took on a different character in the deep hours of the night. Emily often found herself drawn back to the Serpent's Whisper long after Tia had retired, the silence of the penthouse a welcome counterpoint to the day's structure demands. It was during one such late-night session, the city lights a distant, shimmering tapestry outside the panoramic windows, that Adrian Vance found her. He entered not with his usual decisive stride, but with a quiet, almost hesitant presence that made her look up from her delicate work. He was dressed in a dark silk robe, his usually impeccably styled hair slightly disheveled, giving him a softer, more approachable look she hadn't seen before. The pale ice of his eyes seemed to carry a deeper, almost bruised shadow. "Still at it, Miss Hay?" His voice was a low murmur, devoid of its usual commanding edge. Emily nodded, her brush poised over a minute tear in the scroll's parchment. The finer details require absolute quiet. She didn't add that the quiet also allowed her mind to wrestle with the unsettling cessation of the recent sabotages and the unspoken knowledge that Adrian had been behind their abrupt end. The relief had been immense, but it also opened her eyes wider to the ruthless, pervasive nature of his power. He walked over, not stopping at his usual distance, but coming to stand beside her, his proximity a warm, heavy weight in the cool studio air. The scent of him, no longer just expensive cologne, but something more primal, mingled with the earthy aroma of old paper and new solvents. "You seemed agitated earlier this week." His statement wasn't a question, but an observation, direct and unsettlingly accurate. Emily swallowed, her heart quickening. This was it. The opportunity to push, to understand. "Agitated doesn't quite cover it, Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice carefully even. "When one's work is systematically, subtly undermined, when carefully prepared materials are tampered with, when one senses an insidious malice at play, agitated is an understatement." She paused, then met his gaze directly. It stopped. Abruptly. "I suspect you know why." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned from her, moving to the vast window, his back. Once again to the room, the city sprawled beneath him like a conquered beast. "I ensure the integrity of my investment, Miss Hayes." His voice was flat, revealing nothing. "It wasn't just an investment, Mr. Vance. It was an attack on my professional integrity." On the scroll itself, Emily pressed, a newfound boldness coursing through her. She felt an urge, not just to understand, but to challenge the impenetrable walls he had built around himself. "You live in a dangerous world, don't you? Where even the quiet act of restoration is fraught with hidden enemies." He didn't respond for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, almost lost to the vastness of the penthouse. "I was young once. Idealistic, perhaps. Believed in the purity of art, the sanctity of preservation." He paused, a bitter laugh escaping him, harsh and uncharacteristic. "My father, he was a collector too. Not as discerning, perhaps, but he loved his pieces. Trusted implicitly." Emily watched him, her breath caught in her throat. This was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the ruthlessness. "He was betrayed," Adrian continued, his voice taking on a raw edge, "by his closest confidant, a man he considered family. A partner who systematically siphoned off his most valuable assets, replaced genuine pieces with fakes, and ultimately drove him to ruin. The loss wasn't just financial. It was a profound, soul-crushing betrayal. He never recovered. Died a broken man, consumed by suspicion." Adrian finally turned, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, Emily saw not just ice, but a deep, ancient pain swirling within them. "I was barely 20. I watched everything crumble. And I vowed never again. Never to be so naive, so trusting." The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with unspoken history. Emily felt a profound empathy bloom in her chest, replacing the last vestiges of resentment. The ruthless facade, the absolute control, the impenetrable power. It wasn't just about avarice. It was a shield, forged in the fires of devastating betrayal and loss. It was a self-imposed prison, built to protect a deeply wounded heart. "So you built an empire," Emily murmured, her voice soft, understanding. "And you trust no one." He gave a curt, humorless nod. "Trust is a luxury I cannot afford. Vulnerability is a weakness that invites destruction." His gaze, still locked with hers, held a desperate plea she hadn't anticipated, an unspoken question. "Do you understand?" And she did. She understood the crushing weight of his empire, the isolation of his vigilance, the endless war he waged against the shadows of his past. The image of the pale, conniving thorn and Adrian's swift, silent retribution suddenly made terrifying sense. He wasn't just protecting his property. He was protecting himself from another betrayal, another loss. "It must be lonely," Emily whispered, the words escaping before she could censor them. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise, then something deeper, something intensely vulnerable passing between them. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing directly in front of her, the workbench's silent barrier between them. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the subtle tremor in the air that was not from the city outside, but from the raw emotion finally laid bare. "Lonely," he echoed, the word a sigh. His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, lingering. The forbidden attraction, which had been a simmering undercurrent, now surged to the surface, undeniable, intoxicating. In this shared moment of raw intimacy, with the ghosts of his past swirling around them, she saw him, truly saw him, for the first time. The formidable Adrian Vance was a man haunted, a man whose ruthlessness was born of profound pain. And in that moment, a fierce, unexpected desire to protect him, to shield that wounded part of him from the world, ignited within her. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, his gaze searching hers, asking for permission. Emily didn't flinch. Her heart hammered, her breath catching in her throat. The trust that had been slowly building between them solidified into something unbreakable, forged in the crucible of his confession. She found herself accepting his dark side, not as evil, but as a wounded man's defense mechanism. The loyalty she felt was startling, a fierce, protective instinct that transcended her initial captivity. His fingers finally brushed against her cheek, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through her entire being. His thumb gently traced the line of her jaw, and in that touch, in the shared silence, was the unspoken language of undeniable attraction, of a bond irrevocably deepened. The gilded prison had become a sanctuary, and the captor, a man she found herself fiercely, confusingly drawn to and desperate to understand, perhaps even to heal. The annual Vance-sponsored charity auction was not merely a social event. It was the zenith of the art world's calendar, a glittering spectacle where reputations were forged and fortunes were made. Emily, dressed in a sleek, borrowed gown that felt alien against her skin, found herself amidst a throng of New York's elite, a stark contrast to her usual quiet existence in the studio. Adrian, impeccably tailored, moved through the crowd with a predator's grace, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that sent a confusing mix of possessiveness and reassurance through her. She was a conservator, not a socialite, and the sheer opulence of the ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and hushed clinking of champagne flutes, made her profoundly uncomfortable. But tonight, the discomfort was eclipsed by a burgeoning sense of hope. The cracks in Adrian's armor had shown her a depth she hadn't imagined, fostering a connection that was both terrifying and intensely compelling. She had, foolishly perhaps, begun to believe that in this gilded cage, protected by Adrian's formidable, if ruthless power, she might find a new path, a new purpose, even a strange form of belonging. The auction was in full swing when the tenor of the room abruptly shifted. The current item, a minor impressionist landscape, was being presented, but the auctioneer's voice was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, cutting tone from the back of the room. "A moment, if you please, Mr. Sterling." All heads turned. Standing by one of the grand marble columns, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his thin lips, was Mr. Thorne. He held a thick dossier in his hand, its contents visibly bulging. His eyes, devoid of any warmth, fixed on Emily with chilling intensity. A cold dread snaked its way into her stomach. Adrian tensed beside her, his hand pressing almost imperceptibly into her back. "What is the meaning of this, Thorn?" Adrian's voice, usually a low rumble, was now infused with an icy menace that made several nearby conversations falter. Thorn ignored him, his gaze sweeping over the hushed, expectant audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed collectors and connoisseurs, I regret to interrupt this evening's proceedings, but a matter of grave importance, concerning the very integrity of our beloved art world, demands immediate attention." He strode purposefully towards the raised dais, placing his dossier dramatically on the podium. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Emily felt a prickle of fear, a premonition of disaster. This wasn't just another petty squabble. Thorn was playing for much higher stakes. "As many of you know," Thorn continued, his voice resonating with false gravity, "Mr. Vance recently acquired the Serpent's Whisper, a scroll of immense historical and artistic significance. He entrusted its restoration to Miss Emily Hayes, a conservator whose reputation, I must regretfully inform you, is built on a foundation of deceit." The collective gasp that followed was palpable. Emily's blood ran cold. She tried to speak, but her throat had seized up. Adrian's hand tightened on her back, his body language radiating barely controlled fury. "I have here," Thorn proclaimed, opening his dossier with a flourish, "irrefutable evidence. Photographic comparisons, expert analyses from highly respected, independent sources, and forensic reports, all of which demonstrate beyond any doubt that Miss Hayes has not merely restored the scroll, but is engaged in extensive and sophisticated forgery, altering original passages, fabricating entire sections, even replacing genuine materials with expertly crafted fakes." He held up several enlarged photographs, grainy but damning. They showed microscopic details of the scroll, highlighting what appeared to be inconsistencies in brushwork, incongruous material compositions, and suspicious pigment layers. He quoted fabricated expert opinions, citing specific, technical details that sounded horrifyingly credible to an untrained ear. "Miss Hayes, it appears, has systematically and artfully improved upon history, transforming a damaged, but genuine artifact into a masterpiece of her own fraudulent design. A grand deception perpetrated on Mr. Vance, and by extension, on the entire art community." The accusations hammered into Emily like physical blows. Forgery, deception, fraud. Her name, her life's work, her entire identity were being shredded piece by agonizing piece before the most influential people in her world. Her meticulously honest work, her painstaking dedication to preserving history, was being twisted into a grotesque lie. She could feel the eyes of the hundreds of people in the room on her, burning into her with judgment, with disgust, with morbid fascination. The hushed whispers turned into a cacophony of condemnation. Her carefully constructed dreams, her aspirations to carve out a respected place in her field, shattered around her like fragile glass. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a public execution of her career, her future. A wave of nausea washed over her. She felt betrayed, not just by Thorn's malice, but by the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Her mind raced, trying to find words, a defense, anything to counter the tsunami of lies. But Thorn's evidence, though fabricated, was presented with such professional polish, such convincing detail, that it seemed irrefutable. Who would believe her, a conservator with no public profile, against the respected Mr. Thorn, backed by seemingly solid expert testimony? A crushing doubt, cold and insidious, began to creep into her mind. Adrian. He had promised to protect her. He had shown her his vulnerability, his pain. But now, as the humiliation washed over her, as her reputation bled out in front of this unforgiving crowd, she wondered, could even his formidable power stand against such a public, devastating assault? Would he even want to? She saw the fury in his eyes, but also a calculation, a terrifying stillness that suggested he was weighing options, not simply reacting. In that moment of utter despair, she felt utterly alone, completely exposed, her future dissolving into a barren landscape of public shame. Her gilded prison had become a public scaffold. The air in the ballroom was thick with condemnation, a suffocating blanket of whispers and shocked murmurs. Emily stood frozen, impaled by Thorne's venomous accusations, her face burning with humiliation. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, her future crumbling into dust. She risked a glance at Adrian, seeking reassurance, a sign of his unwavering support. But his face was a mask of unreadable stillness, his eyes narrowed, calculating. A chilling tendril of doubt, cold and terrifying, wrapped around her heart. Had she been wrong about him? Would he abandon her, sacrifice her to protect his own formidable image? Then Adrian moved. He detached himself from her side, not with a sudden, aggressive lunge, but with a deliberate, almost languid grace that drew every eye. He ascended the dais with an unnerving calm, a king surveying his besieged domain. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he simply stood beside Thorne, his towering presence utterly dwarfing the sniveling man. The contrast was stark. Thorne, flushed with malicious glee, and Adrian, a statue of cold, commanding power. "Mr. Thorne," Adrian's voice finally cut through the tension, a low, resonant rumble that somehow amplified the sudden silence. "Your theatrical performance is commendable. A pity it is entirely fictional." Thorne's smirk faltered. "Fictional? Mr. Vance, the evidence is overwhelming." "Overwhelmingly fabricated," Adrian interrupted, his voice gaining an icy edge that made even the most hardened collectors lean forward. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, not for a thick dossier like Thorne's, but for a slim, almost unassuming tablet. His fingers danced across the screen. With practiced ease, and suddenly, the massive display screens usually reserved for auction items flickered to life, projecting a series of complex data, high-resolution images, and intricate diagrams. "Mr. Thorne purports to have expert analyses demonstrating Miss Hayes's forgery," Adrian began, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the audience. "Let us examine these so-called experts." A quick cross-reference with global databases reveals that Darrell Vance, cited as a leading forensic art historian, is a registered shell corporation in Panama, with no academic credentials. A ripple of gasps went through the crowd. And Professor Alastair Finch, whose forensic reports are so compelling, is in fact Mr. Thorne's disbarred cousin, currently serving a sentence for art fraud in Switzerland. He clicked another button. The screen displayed a damning financial ledger. Furthermore, the independent sources Mr. Thorne champions appear to be the same offshore accounts that have, for the past 2 decades, facilitated his own systematic practice of art forgery and illicit trading. Adrian's voice, though still calm, now carried the undeniable weight of absolute authority. He proceeded to dismantle Thorne's accusations with surgical precision. He displayed genuine forensic reports of the Serpent's Whisper, showing Emily's meticulous work, cross-referenced with pre-restoration scans from multiple reputable institutions. He highlighted the subtle, irrefutable markers of age and authenticity that Emily had carefully preserved, using advanced spectral analysis and carbon dating data. "Miss Hayes," Adrian stated, his gaze briefly flicking to Emily, a flicker of something akin to admiration in his eyes, has performed a restoration of unparalleled skill and integrity. Her work is not merely technically brilliant, it is an act of profound historical stewardship. The tables had turned with a dizzying speed. Thorne, who moments ago had been radiating triumph, now stood pale and visibly trembling, his eyes darting frantically between Adrian and incriminating evidence flashing on the screens. The self-satisfied smirk had been replaced by a rictus of sheer terror. And now Adrian continued, his voice deepening. "We come to Mr. Thorne's true motive. Beyond his petty vindictiveness towards Miss Hayes, this public spectacle was a desperate attempt to discredit a rival, to distract from his own imminent downfall. For what Mr. Thorne failed to realize is that while he was busy orchestrating this pathetic charade, my team has been systematically uncovering his extensive network of deceit." Another click, and the screens displayed a dizzying array of documents, photographs, and surveillance footage. Thorne's clandestine meetings with known art traffickers, his fraudulent appraisals, his meticulously concealed workshop forgeries. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian announced, his voice now booming, filling the entire ballroom with chilling clarity. "For the past 20 years, Mr. Thorne has operated one of the most sophisticated art forgery and trafficking rings in the world, undermining the very trust our industry is built upon. His prize acquisition, the Aurelius Codex, which he so proudly displays in his gallery, is in fact a masterfully executed modern forgery. My forensic team confirmed this just this morning." The shock in the room was absolute, a collective gasp that reverberated through the opulent space. Thorne crumpled, his face ash gray, his legs seemingly unable to support him. "Effective immediately," Adrian declared, his eyes burning into Thorne with a chilling intensity. "The Vance Corporation is initiating legal proceedings against Mr. Thorne for fraud, racketeering, and gross misconduct. Furthermore, his gallery and all its assets, including the forged Aurelius Codex, are now under immediate acquisition by the Vance Corporation, effective as of this moment." He snapped his fingers, and two of his imposing security detail, Marcus among them, stepped forward, their gazes fixed on Thorne. "You are relieved of your duties, Mr. Thorne. You are under arrest." As Thorne was led away, a pathetic, broken figure, Adrian turned back to the stunned audience. His gaze sought out Emily, and for the first time since the ordeal began, a powerful, possessive warmth entered his eyes. He extended a hand towards her, a silent invitation. Emily, tears of relief and vindication streaming down her face, walked towards him, her steps light with triumph. She reached him, and he didn't just take her hand. He pulled her gently, deliberately, into his side, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist, anchoring her against him. The gesture was overtly possessive, a public declaration that left no room for doubt. And finally, Adrian's voice resonated, now imbued with a deep, unwavering conviction that silenced the last murmurs. "Let there be no further questions regarding Miss Emily Hayes. Her talent is undeniable, her integrity unimpeachable. She is under my direct protection, and any attempt to harm her professionally or personally will be met with the full, unreserved force of my resources. She belongs to me." The last words, "she belongs to me," resonated through the ballroom, an absolute, unapologetic declaration of ownership that would have once terrified Emily. But now, nestled against his strong, protective side, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her, it brought a surge of exhilarating romantic fulfillment. In that moment of profound vindication and public triumph, with Adrian's arm a steel band around her, Emily realized she was not just protected, she was claimed. And against all reason, against every logical impulse, she found herself fiercely devoted to this dangerous, compelling man, unequivocally accepting his formidable, even dark world. Her gilded prison had become her impenetrable sanctuary, and Adrian, her unwavering protector, her unexpected redemption. The chaos of Thorne's public downfall continued long after he was dragged from the ballroom, a crumpled, pathetic figure. Adrian's network, a meticulously woven tapestry of influence and intelligence, moved with brutal efficiency. The immediate acquisition of Thorne's gallery wasn't merely a legal formality. It was a hostile takeover, a systematic dismantling of his illicit empire. News reports, fueled by Adrian's carefully orchestrated leaks, exploded across every major art publication and financial news outlet. The art world reeled in shock, then in outrage, as Thorne's decades of fraud were laid bare for all to see. Emily watched it unfold from the penthouse, a strange mixture of catharsis and profound exhaustion washing over her. The initial days were a blur of adrenaline crash and emotional recovery. Emily felt utterly drained, physically and mentally spent. The public humiliation had left scars, an invisible wound that would take time to heal. She spent hours in the studio, not working on the Serpent's Whisper, but simply sitting, allowing the quiet solitude to slowly mend the frayed edges of her composure. Tia, with uncharacteristic softness, ensured her comfort, bringing gentle teas and light meals, her usually precise demeanor softened by a rare hint of concern. Adrian, however, was a whirlwind of relentless action. His quiet vengeance against Thorne was absolute. He didn't just expose Thorne's criminal enterprise. He He systematically dismantled every facet of his life, ensuring that not only would Thorne face justice, but his name would be forever synonymous with disgrace. Legal teams, forensic accountants, and private investigators worked around the clock, seizing assets, tracking down accomplices, and meticulously cataloging every forgery. Adrian's power, once a source of fear for Emily, now felt like a formidable shield, a force of nature that, when directed correctly, brought a chilling sense of justice. One evening, after the last news reports had faded from the screen and the initial shockwaves had subsided, Adrian found Emily on the terrace, gazing out at the city lights. The cool night air felt soothing against her skin. He sat beside her, a comfortable silence stretching between them for a long moment. "Are you all right, Emily?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He used her first name, a small but significant shift. She turned to him, meeting his gaze. "I will be," she admitted, her voice still a little shaky. It was brutal, but also righteous. A faint smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Adrian, for everything." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. The touch was tender, a silent acknowledgement of the pain she had endured. "I will never let anyone harm you again. Never question your integrity." His voice was a low, fierce vow, steeped in an absolute, unapologetic possessiveness that resonated deep within her. In that moment, all the walls she had instinctively kept up, the lingering remnants of her captivity, professional caution, crumbled completely. The fear of his power, the wariness of his control, dissolved into the overwhelming feeling of being truly, completely seen and protected. A wave of raw passion, fueled by the catharsis of justice and the profound relief of her vindication, surged through her. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers, asking for permission she was more than willing to give. Her hand rose, cupping his jaw, feeling the slight stubble beneath her fingers. Her lips met his tentatively at first, then with a fierce, desperate hunger that mirrored his own. It was a kiss of release, of unspoken promises, of a future finally laid bare. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close against his strong, unyielding frame, and she melted into him, no longer fighting, but embracing the intoxicating reality of their intertwined lives. Later, in the hushed opulence of his bedroom, stripped bare of all pretenses, they found a deeper intimacy. His touch was both tender and demanding, his gaze unwavering as he explored her, mapping her body with a reverence that took her breath away. She discovered a surprising vulnerability in him, a desperate need for connection that belied his formidable exterior. Every kiss, every touch, was a silent conversation, a dismantling of years of solitude and guarded emotions. His words, usually so controlled, became whispered confessions of desire, of a possessive love he had never dared to express. It wasn't just physical. It was a profound emotional communion, a melding of two souls forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. All the conflicting emotions, the initial fear, the grudging respect, the confusing attraction, the dawning empathy, the fierce loyalty, coalesced into an undeniable love. As dawn painted the Manhattan skyline in hues of rose and gold, Emily lay nestled in Adrian's arms, feeling utterly safe, utterly cherished. She knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that her life was irrevocably changed. She was no longer just Emily Hayes' conservator. She was Adrian Vance's. And the thought, once terrifying, now filled her with a thrilling sense of destiny. The next morning, with Thorne's ghost finally purged, a new purpose began. Adrian led her to a vast, pristine laboratory adjacent to the main studio. There, under carefully controlled conditions, lay the Aurelius Codex, Thorne's prized, yet fake acquisition. It was a magnificent forgery, a testament to Thorne's twisted genius, but a forgery nonetheless. "This is yours, Emily," Adrian said, his voice soft, yet firm. "To clean, to analyze, to understand its construction. To strip away the lies and reclaim its true identity, whatever that may be. A cleansing, a rebuilding." Emily ran a gloved hand over the pristine, yet deceitful parchment. The challenge was immense, but unlike the serpent's whisper, This was a project of redemption, of reclaiming truth from falsehood. It was a shared endeavor, a testament to their intertwined reality. She looked at Adrian, his face now devoid of the shadowed pain, replaced by a quiet strength and a possessive devotion that warmed her to her core. Their future, once unimaginable, was now unfolding before them, built on the ashes of betrayal and the promise of a love as complex and enduring as the ancient artifacts they cherished. 2 years had passed since the seismic revelations at the charity auction, 2 years that had transformed not just Emily's life, but the very landscape of the art world. The Aurelius, once a symbol of Thorne's deception, had been entirely reborn. Under Adrian's relentless vision and Emily's meticulous guidance, it had been stripped of every falsehood, every shadow of illicit trade, and resurrected as the Vance Aurelius, a beacon of ethical art, renowned globally for its transparency, provenance research, and most notably, its state-of-the-art restoration department. Emily Hayes, no longer the reluctant captive, now moved through the hallowed halls of the Vance Aurelius as its respected head of restoration. Her studio, expanded and equipped with technologies that pushed the boundaries of conservation, hummed with a quiet, purposeful energy. She led a small, dedicated team, instilling in them the same unwavering commitment to truth and preservation that had defined her own journey. The Serpent's Whisper, meticulously restored to its ancient glory, now rested in a climate-controlled vault, awaiting its eventual public exhibition, a testament to her skill and Adrian's unyielding belief. Their life together had settled into a rhythm, an intricate dance of shared purpose and profound intimacy. Adrian's presence was still ubiquitous, his influence vast, but his possessiveness had softened, evolving into an unwavering, tender devotion that enveloped Emily in a constant cocoon of security. He no longer merely observed her. He collaborated with her, bringing his formidable intellect and resources to bear on the ethical challenges of the art market, often consulting her on complex provenance cases, valuing her unique perspective. One crisp autumn evening, as the city lights began to twinkle against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, Emily found Adrian in their private study within the penthouse. He was not behind his imposing desk, but by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a rare moment of stillness in his relentless schedule. In his hand, he held a delicate, ancient silver locket, one of her latest restoration projects from a particularly challenging medieval collection. "It's finished," Emily said, stepping softly into the room. The filigree was quite fragile, but it should hold now. Adrian turned, a soft smile gracing his lips, a smile she rarely saw, reserved only for her. "Exquisite," he murmured, his thumb tracing the intricate patterns on the locket. "You bring life back to silence, Emily. You find the truth buried beneath the passage of time." He walked towards her, his movements fluid and unhurried. The faint scent of his expensive cologne, once intimidating, now simply smelled like him, a comforting anchor in her world. He took her hands, his touch warm and firm. And in doing so, he continued, his voice low, "You found the truth in me, the man buried beneath the ambition and the scars." Emily's heart swelled. She reached up, her fingers tracing the faint, almost invisible scar on his jawline that Marcus possessed, a silent reminder of the dangerous world he commanded, a world that now, somehow, felt like theirs. "You weren't truly buried, Adrian," she whispered. "Just guarded. And you let me in." His gaze intensified, a deep, unwavering pool of devotion. "I gave you my vulnerability, Emily, and you gave me something I hadn't known was possible. Peace, hope, a future." He gently took her left hand, and her breath caught in her throat as he produced a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark silk, was not a glittering diamond, but a ring of incredible, understated beauty. It was an ancient Roman intaglio, a perfectly preserved sardonyx cameo depicting a protective lioness, set in a simple, elegant band of brushed gold. It was unique, imbued with history, a symbol of strength and fierce loyalty, everything they were. "Emily Hayes," Adrian began, his voice surprisingly husky, "you are the greatest masterpiece of my life. My partner, my confessor, my equal in every way that truly matters. I offer you not just my name, my fortune, or my protection, but my entire unguarded self. My past, my present, and every single moment of my future. He looked into her eyes, a lifetime of unwavering commitment reflected in his gaze. Will you do me the immense honor of becoming my wife? And perhaps, one day, the mother of our children. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, hot and exquisite. This was it, the culmination of a journey that began in fear and resentment, evolving through shared challenge, profound empathy, and ultimately, an undeniable, all-consuming love. This man, once her captor, was now her sanctuary, her destiny. Yes, Adrian, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. He slid the intaglio ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, a symbol of their unique, enduring bond. He pulled her into a fierce, tender embrace, and for a long moment, they simply held each other, the city lights glittering outside, a silent witness to their profound commitment. Later, as they stood by the window, Adrian's arm wrapped around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder, Emily looked out at the glittering expanse. She thought of the serpent's whisper, carefully restored, of the Vance Aurelius revitalized, and of the intaglio on her finger. Her gilded prison had indeed become her sanctuary. She had not only restored ancient artifacts, she had, with Adrian, built a masterpiece of their own, a future brimming with contentment, enduring love, and the boundless promise of a life finally complete. Have you ever felt defined by your past, trapped in a cage others built for you? Emily's journey reminds us that our true value isn't etched by betrayal or misfortune. It's in the resilience to rise, the courage to heal, and the unexpected embrace of a love so fierce it shatters every barrier. Adrian, once her formidable captor, ultimately became her unwavering protector, proving that even the darkest hearts can offer profound healing. If this story touched a chord in your soul, reminding you that your worth is undeniable, and that true love can be found even in the most unlikely places, then stay with us. Like this video, subscribe for more tales of fierce romance and redemption, and share in the comments. I am unbreakable.